The air is colder here, heavier. You are not meant to leave. Listen closely and tell me where you are, silently acknowledging that your presence matters, that you are seen, or risk vanishing like those erased from memory. Every moment you stay binds you deeper into the shadow of what follows. Do not flinch. Do not speak. You will witness what history tried to conceal, what was too grotesque for the scrolls to endure. Now, stay. You are part of this, whether you wish it or not. The queens, once cloaked in silk and crowned in gold, were stripped of more than their garments. The Romans, methodical and unyielding, approached them not merely as enemies, but as symbols to be dismantled. Victory for them was never simple conquest, it was transformation, turning sovereign majesty into submission, divinity into vulnerability. There was ritual in this cruelty, though the historians tried to label it chaos. They sought not only to break bodies, but to fracture dignity, to sow terror among those who might one day rise. In the quiet of their chambers, these women became echoes of despair, their fates sealed by the cold deliberation of steel, fire, and shame. Captured queens were led into spaces where light feared to linger. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, met soldiers trained in the art of psychological obliteration. The Romans understood fear, and they wielded it as skillfully as a gladius. There was no haste, only precision. The touch of a hand, the placement of a guard, the slow unveiling of powerlessness, each detail calculated. These were not mere acts of war, they were ceremonies of annihilation, meant to be remembered, yet officially forgotten. Scrolls speak in whispers, voices in the dust, but the silences are louder than any battle cry. Some queens, whose names have survived only in fragments, resisted silently, a defiance that only sharpened the Roman appetite for domination. They were stripped of titles, paraded, examined, humiliated. Every gesture was observed, catalogued, stored in the soldier's memory. There is testimony in coins, in inscriptions, in the faint traces of palace walls where screams once echoed. Yet much of this history was obliterated, deemed too dangerous, too vivid, too revealing of the empire's true appetite for control. Power, as the Romans knew, was not in the battlefield alone, but in the destruction of identity. And so, the queens became lessons.
To the Romans, they were warnings cast in flesh and spirit, a display to ensure obedience from distant lands. To those who would write the histories, they were inconvenient shadows, best left unmentioned, their suffering dissolved into silence. But some echoes remain, and they are relentless. You have heard them now, just a fragment, and the rest waits. You cannot turn away. You will see what they did, and you will remember. Your presence binds you to the same inevitability that consumed them. The queens were never allowed the comfort of solitude. Their chambers became cages, though built with the finest stones, adorned with tapestries that mocked rather than soothed. Every window a reminder of the world they had lost, every corridor patrolled with unyielding eyes. The Romans understood the potency of anticipation. Hours stretched into days, measured not by the sun, but by the steady, oppressive presence of power. In these silent intervals, terror was cultivated. The mind, left unguarded, became the battlefield. Each heartbeat was a drum of dread, each breath a whispered reminder that surrender was inevitable. Those who faltered first paid the highest price, and the lessons endured long after the act itself. The process was systematic. The soldiers, often young men hardened in campaigns that had long since dulled their humanity, were taught the sacred precision of dominance. They studied the queen's movements, her glances, her smallest gestures, interpreting resistance as invitation for escalation. There was an artistry to this cruelty, a choreography of psychological destruction. Clothing, jewelry, and insignias of rank were removed in deliberate sequence, each item snatched away as a symbol not of conquest, but of erasure. With each piece gone, a fragment of identity fell into the hands of those who thrived on subjugation. Some queens resisted openly, their voices raised in defiance, their bodies tensing against the ritualistic disassembly. These were the rare, fleeting moments when the air itself seemed to shiver. The Romans welcomed it, for defiance sharpened terror. The mind, confronted with both power and humiliation, fractured in ways that left enduring scars. Few historians dare to dwell on these fractures, choosing instead to speak of battles, of treaties, of crowns exchanged. But here, in these hidden chambers, true history was forged in fear, etched into memory, and sealed with silence. It was not only physical domination that they exacted. The Romans employed subtler instruments: isolation, whispered threats, the knowledge that outside the palace walls, armies and kin could not intervene. Messages were sent through invisible channels, the implication clear: no ally, no sanctuary, no mercy awaited. The queens became symbols of vulnerability, their suffering a spectacle of inevitability, designed to instruct both conqueror and conquered. Every act, every touch, every carefully measured pause was a note in this unholy symphony of control. And yet, amid the orchestrated terror, glimpses of human resilience flickered. A whispered prayer, a secret gesture, the smallest act of defiance. It was enough to remind the soldiers that power, while immense, could never completely consume spirit. The empire attempted to crush these sparks, but history, in its quiet way, preserves them. You, who listen now, are drawn into this continuum. You are both observer and participant, bound by the same inevitability, compelled to witness what was meant to vanish. And as you do, understand, there is no turning back. They were stripped not only of garments, but of context, memory, and claim. The queens, once sovereigns of their realms, were reduced to echoes in rooms that smelled of incense and iron, of sweat and inevitability. The Romans approached their task with a ritualistic patience, aware that terror must be cultivated, not rushed. Each step was calculated, every gaze measured, every whisper carried the weight of doom. To them, a queen's dignity was a weapon. To dismantle it was to assert the absolute dominion of Rome over both body and mind. The captives were often moved through labyrinthine corridors, their passage orchestrated to disorient. They were made to see the insignias of conquest on every wall, to hear the muted laughter of those who held them. Silence was broken only by the soft clinking of armor or the distant echoes of orders. Sleep, if it came at all, was brief and fragmented, leaving minds frayed, ready for the next stage of submission. Food, conversation, even light were manipulated to reinforce dependence and compliance. Every detail, mundane or grotesque, was an instrument in the larger symphony of domination. Soldiers were trained to read terror like scripture. A tightening of the jaw, a lowered gaze, a flinch, each signal guided the next act. There was artistry here, a cold, precise choreography of fear. They understood that the mind could be torn as efficiently as flesh.
And when bodies were broken, or adorned with signs of humiliation, the effect rippled beyond the immediate room. News of their degradation would reach distant provinces, ensuring that the empire's reach was felt even in absence. Submission became contagious, fear inevitable. Some queens, fierce in spirit, attempted subtle resistance. Their defiance, however, was noted, catalogued, and addressed with ritualized cruelty. It was not only punishment, but education, for the queen, for the soldiers, and for the world watching from shadows. The Romans believed in demonstrating the cost of rebellion. The acts of psychological dominance, though quiet and controlled, left marks that history often chose to erase. Scrolls and inscriptions rarely detailed these rituals. They were too intimate, too potent, too corrupting to be recorded without risk. And so the story survives only in fragments, in the silence between lines, in the hints left by artifacts and whispers of chroniclers who dared not speak fully. The queen's agony, their endurance, their fleeting moments of defiance, they remain shadows, reminders of the empire's capacity for absolute control. You who hear this now are drawn into that shadow. You are bound to it. You feel the inevitability, the gravity, the inescapable truth of what was done and how history tried to hide it. And in that understanding, you too become a witness to the same cold dominion. The ceremonies of domination did not end with mere capture. They extended into the intimate spaces where the queens once found solace, now transformed into theaters of inevitability. The Romans understood that true conquest was never complete until the mind bent fully beneath the weight of fear and humiliation. Each day, each hour, each gesture was a deliberate incision into identity, a carving away of power and self-possession. These women, once rulers of nations, became instruments in a lesson of control, their suffering both private and public, visible and erased. The soldiers, trained to embody the empire's authority, observed, catalogued, and manipulated every reaction. Silence, they knew, was as telling as protest. Tears were measured. Resistance, when detected, was met with a methodical escalation designed to impress both terror and inevitability upon the captive. They learned the subtle language of fear, a glance that pierced, a hand that lingered, a whispered command that resonated in the mind long after it was spoken.
Nothing was left to chance. The human psyche became a landscape for their domination, and the queens, the unwilling architects of their own subjugation. Every object in the chamber carried meaning. A tapestry, a chair, a goblet, each became a tool, a symbol of control. Jewelry stripped, robes removed, crowns discarded. These acts were more than symbolism. They were instruments of erasure. The body, once a vessel of sovereignty, became a canvas of vulnerability. Yet even in this reduction, traces of defiance flickered. A hidden glance, a clenched fist, a whispered prayer. Small acts that challenged the absolute, reminding both captor and captive that power, while terrifying, was never absolute. Whispers reached the distant provinces. News traveled in fragments, carried in hushed tones, in rumors, in coins bearing altered images of fallen queens. Each whisper reinforced the lesson. Resistance had a price. Obedience was survival. Memory was fragile. The Romans cultivated fear not only to dominate those present, but to send a ripple of inevitability across lands they had conquered. Their control extended beyond the palace, beyond the throne, into the minds of those who had never seen the chains but felt their weight nonetheless. And yet, the most potent terror lay in what was never written, in the erasure of records, in the absence of chroniclers willing to tell the full story. The empire achieved something beyond physical domination. The queen's suffering became both omnipresent and invisible, a ghostly testament to Rome's absolute authority. You who listen now are part of that continuum. The weight of inevitability presses on you as it did on them. Every heartbeat, every breath is a witness. And in listening, you are compelled to remember what was meant to vanish. The final stages of their subjugation were not always marked by violence, but by the quiet, inescapable collapse of power. The queens, whose voices once commanded armies and shaped empires, were reduced to shadows of themselves. The Romans did not need to strike with a sword. The mere presence of inevitability was sufficient. Their rituals were designed to suffocate dignity, to bend will, to make the impossible seem natural. In those chambers, time lost meaning. Hours and days merged, measured only by the slow erosion of spirit, each moment a hammer against identity. They were watched constantly, yet invisibly.
Every gesture, every hesitation, every instinctive attempt to reclaim agency was noted, anticipated, and countered. Silence was never empty. It was charged with threat. A glance from a guard, a shadow across a wall, a soft click of armor, these were instruments of psychological torture. The queens learned that resistance was not only futile, but observable, a spectacle that invited more precise cruelty. Each subtle act of defiance was catalogued, every fear exploited, until the line between agency and surrender blurred entirely. In some cases, the captives were forced into acts that symbolized ultimate humiliation, yet they were always framed as inevitability, as ritual. It was never random, never chaotic. Each humiliation was a lesson in submission, an assertion of absolute dominion, a reminder that Rome erased not only kingdoms, but the very essence of rulers. And while the external world might see them adorned, escorted, or even ostensibly alive, the reality within these walls was one of complete erasure. Their sovereignty had been consumed quietly, methodically, and with an artistry that ensured both fear and silence would persist long after the queens themselves. The empire documented these lessons only sparingly, if at all. Historians, either complicit or terrified, left behind fragments, brief mentions in letters, faint traces in coins, subtle alterations in architecture. The most terrifying acts, the slow, deliberate dismantling of identity, were left unspoken, erased from memory, but no less effective. The true horror was that these rituals were never truly secret. They were omnipresent yet invisible, felt in the ripple of authority, in the compliance of subjects, in the quiet understanding that resistance carried a price beyond imagining. And so, what remains is shadow and echo. The queen's names survive as whispers, their suffering as lessons etched into the foundations of power itself. You who hear this are drawn into that continuum. You feel the inevitability, the suffocating gravity, the moral weight that consumed them. In listening, you are part of the same ritual, a witness to the same dominion, compelled to remember what history tried to erase. You cannot step away. The shadows cling. The silence endures. The queens who survived, if only in body, emerged unrecognizable even to themselves.
Their features remained, but the essence that had once defined them, the audacity, the sovereignty, the untouchable authority, had been meticulously stripped away. Rome did not leave these women broken merely to show dominance. It left them as living testaments to inevitability, warnings carved into flesh and psyche alike. Every glance they offered was weighed, every movement measured, as if the empire itself watched from beyond the veil of history, ensuring the lesson persisted. Their return, if permitted, to any semblance of court or council was never triumphant. They walked among people who whispered, who observed, who feared the contagion of what had been visited upon them. The aura of invincibility was gone, replaced by the heavy shadow of forced compliance. And yet, within these confines, small resistances flickered, faint and fleeting, like sparks in a smothered fire. A quiet refusal, a secret glance, a hidden symbol of self. These were acts of rebellion the empire could not fully extinguish, reminders that spirit, though pressured, is never entirely surrendered. The Romans, having executed their designs, often dispersed these women across provinces, or held them as trophies within the empire's labyrinthine network of power. Their suffering became invisible to most, yet the architecture of terror remained imprinted in every stone, every corridor, every silence of the places they had occupied. It was a system of memory and erasure, a psychological theater in which conquest was as much about what could not be written as what was enacted. History, sanitized and partial, only hints at the cruelty endured, yet the essence, the resonance, persists for those who are willing to perceive it. Some fragments survive, inscriptions that hint at captivity, coins that subtly rewrite image and narrative, letters that allude to despair without detailing its shape. The record is incomplete, deliberately so. The full horror, the slow dismantling of kingship, the erasure of will, the orchestration of terror, was reserved for the eyes of those who enacted it, the whispers of those who survived. And now, for you, listening binds you to that continuum. In understanding their suffering, you inherit a silent obligation to remember what the victors hoped to obliterate, to witness the unrecorded rituals of power, to feel the weight of inevitability that no chronicler dared fully capture. And so the queens remain shadows, their stories half erased, yet wholly present. Their terror, their endurance, and the psychological mastery imposed upon them echo through time, seeking the minds of those who dare confront it. You, who hear this, are now part of that echo. You cannot step away. You are bound, like they were, to the inevitability, the silence, and the shadow of what Rome chose to impose, and history tried desperately to erase. The final lesson remains. Power is absolute, memory is fragile, and those who witness must carry the weight of both. History does not record the private horrors of the conquered in full. The queens who endured Rome's calculated domination became specters of inevitability, living proofs of the empire's reach beyond armies and walls. Their bodies, though intact, were maps of suffering, their minds, landscapes of quiet torment. Each day, each interaction, each orchestrated act of submission was a thread in a tapestry designed to erase not only sovereignty, but identity itself. Nothing was left to chance. Fear was cultivated with patience, precision, and an almost ritualistic devotion. The chambers in which they were held became theaters of subtle terror. Every object, every sound, every shadow was leveraged to remind them of their fragility. Guards moved with the discipline of ritual dancers, their presence both constant and invisible, a reminder that every thought, every hesitation was observed. The queen's responses, small flinches, stolen glances, whispered words, were interpreted, catalogued, and exploited. In this way, the empire extended its dominion beyond walls, beyond crowns, beyond life itself. Psychological mastery, the Romans knew, was more enduring than the sword. Yet resistance never fully vanished. Hidden defiance persisted, faint but persistent. A secret gesture, a subtle act of non-compliance, a whispered prayer, these flickers reminded both captors and captives that power, though overwhelming, was never absolute. Rome sought to extinguish them, to convert majesty into obedience, but spirit, even when fractured, retained traces of rebellion. These moments, though fleeting and dangerous, were the last bastions of humanity in a system designed to eradicate it. The empire's true terror was in this intimate annihilation, a psychological assault so total that few chroniclers dared mention it. Rumors of these acts traveled quietly through the provinces, carried in whispers, in coins, in altered inscriptions. The lessons were encoded in fear, transmitted not as orders, but as inevitabilities.
To resist was not only futile, it was to invite methodical ruin. The queen's suffering became invisible, a shadow history sought to ignore, yet its echoes reached across time. Each whisper of their endurance, each faint trace of their resistance, reinforced the silent lesson of dominance. Identity could be stripped, memory could be manipulated, and fear could be weaponized beyond the battlefield. And now, as you hear this, you are drawn into that shadow. You are compelled to bear witness, to feel the weight of what was meant to vanish, to acknowledge the meticulous erasure of sovereignty and spirit. The queen's torment persists in silence, in absence, in shadow. You are no longer merely observer. You are entwined in inevitability, bound to the echo of psychological mastery that shaped, destroyed, and erased. Remember, power leaves marks unseen, and history remembers only what survives its erasures. The final echoes of those queens' suffering linger not in the chronicles of victory, but in the quiet architecture of fear the Romans left behind. They were moved, one by one, into spaces where even shadows seemed constrained, where air itself was heavy with expectation. There, ritualized terror reached its apex, not in noise or blood, but in silence, in the meticulous dismantling of authority. A crown removed, a gesture misread, a glance recorded. Each moment was a lesson in inevitability, a demonstration that submission was not requested, but demanded. The soldiers, instruments of Rome's cold precision, understood that domination was as much psychological as physical. They observed, they catalogued, they whispered commands that resonated beyond the walls. They knew fear when it was subtle, when it flickered in the eyes, when it lingered in posture or hesitation.
Every act of the queens became data, a map of resistance, a blueprint for deeper control. And yet, for all their calculation, they could not entirely extinguish the remnants of defiance. Small sparks survived, fragile, hidden, whispering that power, though overwhelming, was never absolute. Rumors of their captivity, fragments of indignity and endurance, trickled through provinces, carried by merchants, servants, and soldiers. Coins bore altered images, letters hinted at distress. History, sanitized by chroniclers fearful of Rome's reach, left gaps where the true acts of psychological and ceremonial violence had occurred. These erasures were themselves a tool of control.
What was unseen, what was deliberately forgotten, reinforced the empire's omnipotence. To erase was as much a weapon as the sword. And yet, in the quiet resistance, in the traces that survived, a lesson endures. The queens, though broken, retained fragments of identity, of spirit. A hidden glance, a private gesture, a whispered prayer. These were acts of rebellion so subtle that the empire could not fully claim them. The Romans sought absolute control, but even in the meticulous orchestration of humiliation, a shadow of autonomy persisted. This quiet defiance became the ultimate witness to human resilience, a reminder that even when history attempts to erase, the truth lingers in silence, in shadow, in memory. You, who have listened, are now part of that continuum. The inevitability they endured presses upon you. The psychological mastery, the subtle terror, the orchestrated erasure, they are not distant. You cannot step away. You are drawn into the same shadow, bound to the same lesson. Power leaves marks unseen. Identity can be assaulted. Memory is fragile, and yet it persists. You are compelled to remember what Rome tried to bury. And in that remembrance, you become both witness and inheritor of the same silent dominion.